Something else that needs to be looked at in this time period is the new labor systems that develop in these colonized areas. In the same way that when Europeans colonized the Americas and the native population began dying out in large numbers, Europeans were forced to find new sources of labor and new methods of labor in order to extract the resources and the raw materials that they wanted out of the Americas. And in the 19th century, the same thing has to be done as well. Again, Europeans aren't moving to these areas in large numbers. So even though travel and trade is being facilitated at faster and faster rates thanks to industrialization, Europeans are not the majority of the population in these areas. So they've got to develop new systems of labor that will allow them to extract the necessary resources while avoiding the same pitfalls that they had had in the Americas. Um, One of the ways that they go about this is they establish a new plantation economy. This is especially prevalent in Southeast Asia and in sub-Saharan Africa. And essentially, what would happen is once Europeans laid claim to the land, they would then begin dividing it up into large-scale cash crop plantations. Now, by this point in history, pretty much all of the Western European states have outlawed slavery. So slavery is not a legal option here. However, it is an economic option. And the way that these people would be economically enslaved is that once their land was taken out from under them and no other land was available for the traditional subsistence farming, they would be forced onto these large European plantations, working for incredibly low wages, harsh military style living conditions, basically sleeping in barracks. And what would happen is very similar to sharecropping in the southern United States after the Civil War, is they would be charged rent for sleeping in these, bearskin, awful barracks. They would be charged rent for the tools that they use. They would have to pay for meals, et cetera, et cetera. And what this would do is essentially work these people into large scale, massive debt to the point where they were simply working in order to be able to get up and work the next day. They really stood no chance of paying off these kind of landowner debts, almost a new system of feudalism being put into place here. A lot of times, what would also happen is that these plantations would be very seasonal, so they would require mass amounts of labor in certain months, and then much less labor in other months. So seasonal workers would be brought in, they would be worked to exhaustion, and then once the planting or the harvesting season was over, they would essentially be out of work and they would have to move on and find new work. And again, because of the advancements in transportation, namely railroads and steamboats, this allows for a highly movable migrant worker population, right? Now, in other colonized areas, what develops is a new system of forced labor known as the quota system. Now, this is not slavery in the chattel legalized sense that we are familiar with. However, it was required forced labor for a certain amount of goods or a certain amount of hours or a certain amount of days per month. And essentially, what would happen is that the colonial powers would set quotas per village or per family of a certain amount of material that must be produced. And those quotas would have to be met every single month. In some cases, the punishments for not meeting quotas are horrifically abusive. The most notable example of this is in the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II, where entire villages are burned down. Hands are cut off with machetes if quotas are met, beatings, whippings, in some cases, kidnappings, and the family members and children of people are held for ransom if they don't meet their quotas. So, this new system of forced labor, although not legally slavery, essentially matches the dehumanizing process that chattel slavery saw in the Americas in the 16th century. One final system of labor that also develops is the system of migrant labor known as coolies. So, coolie was a derogatory term that was initially given to Chinese immigrants who moved south into Indonesia and the Spice Islands to work on plantations in those areas. But it became kind of a general term in the 19th century for any unskilled, uneducated, low wage labor. And these coolies would essentially be shuffled around almost as indentured servants from plantation to plantation, or mine to mine, or building project to building project. And a lot of these people are forced into these conditions, partially because in their countries of origin, there are no available jobs. The labor market has dried up completely. Many of them begin as skilled artisans or businessmen, but the influx of cheap manufactured goods from Western Europe and the United States essentially runs many of them out of business. And in order to survive, they're forced to seek whatever accommodations, whatever labor they can. The majority of this coolie labor comes from India and China. Many Indians migrate to Africa and Southeast Asia. In fact, the majority of the railroads that the British build throughout sub-Saharan Africa are built by Indian labor because they had previous experience with railroads as well as bridge building technology and engineering. A lot of Chinese migrant labor heads south to, like I said, Indonesia and the Spice Islands. A lot of it also heads west to the Americas. The majority of railroads built in the western United States are all built by Chinese coolie labor as well, right? So here you can see, just a little bit of the brutality of the quota system. These pictures are from the Belgian Congo under King Leopold II. The Congo becomes essentially the height of physical and mental and economic abuse of the imperial system. In fact, it becomes so dramatic that Leopold II is actually forced to step down by his own parliament and pressure from the Kaiser of Germany in 1908, because the situation had become so incredibly abusive and so damaging to the reputation of Europeans in Africa and elsewhere, right? Here's some more photos. Um, at the top there, you have migrant coolies. Many of them are Southeast Asian or Chinese working tea fields in northern India. You also have indentured domestic servants down here at the bottom right, serving as carriage carriers, as rickshaws for wealthy colonial Europeans. Now, part of what we just talked about with these new labor systems was the regular migration of people looking for work, because the economies within their homelands have been basically subverted by cheap manufactured goods from the West. Um, but they're not the only ones on the move during this time period. There are some settler colonies that are set up. New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, all grow as settler colonies. In a lot of cases, the people who are settling in these colonies are the former aristocracy from Western Europe. In the 19th century, a lot of these aristocratic families in Western Europe have really lost the majority of the power and the status that they've had in Europe thanks to industrialization. And in order to reestablish themselves socially and economically in the home country, a lot of them take up the mantle of colonization, claiming new lands, building railroads and building projects around the world, establishing plantations in India and the Indian Ocean and Africa. In a lot of cases, some of them are seeking money, some of them are seeking adventure, some of them are seeking glory. In some cases, people take this up as a religious and a cultural mission in order to bring civilization to these poor, underprivileged, inferior races and ethnicities. Now, at the same time, while settler colonies are being set up in and around Africa and Asia, you also have the beginnings of what's known as prison colonies. And this happens thanks to the growing population in Europe. You have pretty dramatic food pressures that are pushing people into migration. So a lot of these Western European states begin to take advantage of what they see as empty land to offload the kind of bottom of the barrel of their society. The colonization of Australia initially begins this way, where prisoners from Great Britain are given essentially two choices, right? Like you can live out the rest of your sentence in jail, or we can take you to this incredibly harsh environment that you know nothing about, and you can try to eke out a living there, and we'll reestablish you as a British citizen and commute your sentence. And you know, given that choice, tens of thousands of British prisoners immediately sign up. And the success of Australia encourages other Western European states to do the same thing. So you have, small prisoner colonies start popping up all over, especially in the islands of the Pacific. Now, the other mass form of migration that is going on at this point is not a resettlement type of location, as with these settler or these prison colonies. This is more of a constant migration, and that is the coolie labor. Um, the coolie labor never really settles down in one area. Again, they're driven by labor demands in the more sparsely populated colonies. Anytime there is a large scale building project, there is a dam to be built, there is a bridge to be built, there is a railroad to be built. Coolie labor will always be brought in from usually India or China. Um, Now, one of the negative side effects of the coolie labor, besides the mistreatment of the coolie labor itself, is that this actually kind of has the same effect that women and children entering the labor market did in Western Europe, is this drives down wages for indigenous people. As this cheap coolie labor now enters the colony and they're willing to work for less than the indigenous people, the indigenous colonized people now have to be willing to meet those wage demands, which drives more debt and more poverty in their communities. At the same time, what it also does is it also drives ethnic tension and hatred among colonized people, which unfortunately is playing directly into the hands of the colonizers.